is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you so much for joining us this week. This week brings you another interview. I am so excited to have him on the show. He's the host of Serious Inquiries Only, which is I think one of the coolest podcasts in the atheist space right now. Thomas Smith, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hey, doing good. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thank you so much for coming on. I really have liked your show for a long, long time. I think you are a really articulate voice in this space, and I think a very good critic of sort of mainstream, in some respects, mainstream atheism, mainstream skepticism. Previously on my podcast, I had Sarah Nicholson, who was on the Women Beyond Belief podcast, and we had a conversation about who she called the atheist gods. So people like Sam Harris and Dawkins and Hitchens, and sort of how often in our space, there isn't a lot of criticism of them because we sort of think of them as, in some respects, I guess, weirdly enough, think of them as hallowed figures. But yet I think you're one of the most articulate voices who makes a really good case for, I think, sometimes where they're wrong and where they're problematic. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's just the magic of editing. I'm actually not very articulate, but yeah, I'll take it. Yeah, sure.
Editing is amazing. Absolutely amazing. So first, I'd just like to discuss a little bit about your background. So how did you come to atheism and skepticism? What was your upbringing like?
Well, it's hard to say exactly because, is exactly why I turned out the way I did, I guess. But I was raised to go to church, but in my family, it was, for some reason, maybe because my dad was not really active and was kind of an atheist. I guess I wasn't really sure, but I assume he's an atheist. And my mom was religious. Somehow it ended up that like the men in my family were atheists and the women are actually really religious. So like it's somehow that pattern is just my whole family is that. The women are. My sisters and my mom are very, very religious. Well, I shouldn't say very, very religious. That's a relative term, of course. I mean, they're not members of any cults or anything like that, but they are devout and they are, they're very into their Catholic faith. And My brother and my dad were just atheists, I guess. But the only thing I remember my whole life is wanting to believe in God and then not being able to. Like I've always wanted it to be true. But it just never, I think it just, at a certain point in my life, maybe when I was like 16, I realized like, I've just been kidding myself. Like it really, I've been trying, I've been kind of saying like, yeah, there's probably something, but it just, I don't think it ever made sense to me.
Yeah. So maybe we can just spend a quick second sort of unpacking that a little bit. So when you said, you wanted to believe, why did you want to believe? And then conversely, why couldn't you believe?
Well, I would love for there to be some great afterlife where everything makes sense. I think there's a lot of atheists who like to talk down on that idea, but that would be great. I would love it if there was some ultimate point to everything and there was some higher realm of existence where somebody knew all the answers to all the questions. We don't live in that universe. I think it's really clear we don't live in that universe. And I guess that goes to the second part of the question. It's just fundamentally incompatible with that. I mean, the reality that we witness every day with people starving to death and dying of disease and all this horrible stuff, it's just not compatible. People try to do tricks to make it compatible. But ultimately, I think I guess you'd call it in philosophy of religion terms, you'd say the problem of evil. I guess it's that. I don't know if there's more to it than that in my mind, but it really just isn't compatible with a God of any kind. I mean, any sort of, not even like an all-knowing, super awesome, amazing mega God, like even just a pretty nice God. Like just like imagine if we were able to have control of some, simulation right now, and we, for whatever reason, like even crappy humans, I'm pretty sure would make things better than what the real world has been, which is just not just the suffering of humans, but the suffering of millions and indeed billions of years of life just dying and suffering and the point of just pointless existence. I just watched Planet Earth for a minute.
Oh yeah.
And then you realize that, oh my, that depresses me. That show it's really hard to watch.
Even with David Attenborough's nice voice?
Exactly. Yeah, because he's about to, you're seeing some magnificent bird or some crap. And then David Attenborough's like, yeah, see, this thing's either going to die or it's about to eat something else cool that's going to die. Like everything is within an inch of its life in nature at all times. Just everything is within an inch of its life. It has to do all this horrible stuff to even survive. And then it will die anyway. No one would set it up that way. I mean, it's no above average being would would set it up that way.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, one of the ways I always kind of think about it is that there's a view of life that often wants this sort of ultimate meaning or ultimate purpose. And I think conversely, at least for me, the moment that I sort of left religion, and I wasn't that religious, my parents were non-religious and I didn't really grow up with religion at all, but to become sort of more explicitly sort of a skeptic and atheistic, I found it to be a very freeing experience because it allowed me to sort of really be interested in my life for the first time. You know, there's that classic quote of, it's either attributed to Confucius or it's attributed to either Epicurus or Marcus Aurelius. That is, you have two lives. The second one begins when you realize you only have one. And I always really liked that phrase, and that's kind of always how I viewed life. When I was in high school, like I didn't think that deeply about a lot of stuff, other than like poetry, because I was really into poetry and I wanted to be like Bob Dylan and be a musician and shit. But it wasn't until I sort of left religion and by the time I was in college that life became way more interesting to me because I was so interested in acknowledging sort of the intransigence of life, the impermanence of life. Gave me an impetus to sort of care, which I think is very interesting. I know that's rare for most people, but for me, it gave me an impetus to care because I realized like, oh wait, this is the only life I'm guaranteed to have.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that a lot of that comes down to psychology. I think it's my belief is that there's a lot of that kind of mental well-being and framework that I really think is innate in a lot of ways because I look at the same facts and I have the exact opposite feeling. You know, it's just like I feel everything feels pointless to me a lot of the time, and it's been a big battle in my life to not just feel like that all the time. And I'm constantly fighting against just feeling like, what is the point? You know, and I think that a lot of atheists try to turn that around, and they should. Like I don't blame anyone, and if you feel that way, that's awesome. I wish I could feel the way you do, and I don't mind anyone who's trying to spin it that way, or even if they're not spinning it, even if it's just that's how it is for them, that's good. But for me, sometimes I wonder if people really have that, or if they have that feeling first and then everything else. You know what I mean? Because I think and it might just be me. Like I might just have a feeling that things are pointless first and then rationalize it second, you know, just as maybe someone else has a feeling like, oh, well, I'm just going to make the best of everything. That's great. And then the facts come after that.
I think that's fair because I can tell you just even with my own perspective, that's not to say that I don't have a certain level of sadness. I mean, I've written about this before previously, and I need to republish it from the news site, but I wrote it a couple years ago about living with anxiety and depression as someone without religion, because I do have both anxiety and depression. And I think for me, what depresses me about life isn't so much sort of what's the point? I think for me, the most of my depression is very internal. So it's all about, do people like me? Do people care about me? Am I doing what I need to do in life? Am I achieving things? I hate to fail. Like in life, for me, I would rather die than to fail. And the fear of failure is something that motivates me very greatly. I don't know why. I think part of it might be my upbringing and the fact that, I grew up, my parents divorced when I was younger. And I didn't have a huge stable sort of framework for my upbringing until I was in my teens. So I think that, sadness can strike us in different ways. There's a terrific book. If you've never checked it out, I highly recommend it if you're somebody interested in sort of the subject. There's a book called The Noonday Demon. It's by Andrew Solomon, and he's a man who writes for like the New Yorker and everything. But it's a book about basically like the history of depression / memoir. And he sort of talks about his own form of depression, then goes into talking about what we know in science, various literary manifestations of depression, depression, and it's a terrific book. And it really helped me try to unpack depression and what depression is, because I totally agree with you that I think psychologically we can all sort of feel either happy or sad or depressed or sort of motivated, but that those depressions and motivations are, I think, driven by different things.
Right. I don't know how much obviously who knows, and it's all individual, and people have their individual experiences, but I wonder how much it really is dependent on broader philosophy and is more dependent on internal psychology, kind of, because I relate to a lot of what you just said. And also the other example that I always have in my life is that of my wife, who was just raised without religion, like just no emphasis on, like, she's definitely an atheist, but she didn't have like, a deconversion and all that. Is just, what is that? No, I don't do that. And it doesn't factor in for her at all. And she is just by nature a very happy person. So like it's so different. We're both atheists, but like the most different kind of atheists. And for her, it doesn't, like, I really do think she had a great upbringing, great parents. And I think that can be a big, because I relate to where you came from more, where I think that there can be a lot of things that happen to our psychology when our parents do certain things, or don't do certain things. And I think it never goes away, unfortunately.
Oh, totally. I mean, and I can relate to that as well. My wife is also an atheist, but she could give a shit is kind of the way I describe it. She knows that I do, like, she's very supportive of me doing this stuff, and she's very helpful, and she's always happy for me to work on this stuff, but she's not interested in it. She doesn't follow the debates. She doesn't follow the leaders. She gets names mixed up, which is really funny. But yeah, she just doesn't care. But yeah, she doesn't really have belief, but she just does not care. And in a lot of ways, like you, the problem of evil was a big thing for her. The big thing for me, honestly, like, the reason I'm an atheist is, in a lot of ways, is epistemology. I just don't think that you can get knowledge without the capacity of, like, cognition and reasoning. This idea of, like, revealed wisdom or personal experience, that really just doesn't mean much to me. And
I mean, I'm sure you don't mean this, but what do you mean by not? I'm sure there's plenty of knowledge you can get by personal experience, but you just mean.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Revelation. Oh, yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So I'm not discounting people's personal experiences, like, in the real world or anything like that, or any sort of, like, the perspective of learning from others. No, that's not what I mean. What I mean by is when people say, like, near-death experiences, or that they can talk to the dead, or that they have extrasensory perception, things like that, things that are sort of beyond the realm of reason.
And it's just so obvious looking at history, where these stories come from, and every culture has a different one, and they're not compatible. Like, all that stuff is just so clearly the case that it's just a human invention. And it evolved, like, how much it's changed, especially Christianity, how much it's changed. Christianity today would be unrecognizable to the first Christians. They would, they would be like, well, I don't know what you're talking about.
That's true. My friend and I were actually having a conversation about this the other day. He's an atheist, and he's kind of my co-creator of this project with me, but he's very interested in theology. And we talked about the difference between sort of the early Gnostic Christians and the Christians after Aristotle. So most of the Gnostic Christians of the early, like third or fourth or fifth centuries, most of them were what you would describe as sort of the Gnostics or the mystics. So they thought that, divine revelation from God was the only true knowledge, and that they had a connection to, they sort of had a direct line to God. And that kind of viewpoint goes to the wayside with the resurgence of Aristotelian philosophy and Thomas Aquinas, and sort of setting up logical proofs and shit like that. And so I find it very interesting how Christianity evolved from sort of a more mystical place to trying to put this sort of framework of logic around it. And to me, it just seems like either way, I think it's important to acknowledge the limitations of human reasoning, especially when it comes to thinking that, like, I can talk to the dead, or that I have a direct line with God.
Well, yeah, and especially because, I think that if I grew up in the 1700s, it might be a different story. Who knows what I would believe. But now, given that we have a really good explanation in the form of evolution for why we aren't just the same as all these other animals, And then actually, in a lot of ways, why we are the same as so many other animals, and that we were in geological time or in evolutionary time a minute ago, we were just the same as all these other animals that we find ourselves with. There's no reason that our feelings are any more important. Like there are feelings that like, oh, there must be something more, or there, I feel like there could be a presence or the universe, it's just, obviously it's just nonsense. Like it's just things that we feel because of certain, emotions we have and needs we have and all that. And we're a few 100,000 years from just being some sort of chimpanzee-like animal. And it just seems so clear to me that there's nothing special about us, other than there's a lot special about us, but not in this respect, like we're not so special that we had to be made by some all-powerful being.
Yeah. And I would say additionally, I mean, so obviously I think that's a great description of sort of the sciences of it. But I would say, as somebody who's a historian and comes from the tradition of liberal arts, I look at it through sort of the historical lens as well, that I really genuinely believe that being an atheist or being an out free thinker is genuinely a position of privilege. And so if we lived, say, in like the 1700s, and let's say, we lived before, a vibrant industrialized country with a middle class, and we belonged to the lower classes, and we weren't given education, and we were under sort of the thumb of either feudalism or some form of monarchy, it's very likely that we would have either been believers, because that would have really been the only game in town, or we would have had to have been very covert and secretive freethinkers in that regard. And I think we often discount just how revolutionary the idea of rejecting gods and rejecting supernaturalism is, and how, we can read a statement like Immanuel Kant when he writes in the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason, he says, our current age is an age of criticism. And he essentially argues that the church is not above its criticism, despite its decrees and despite its institutions. It has to be held up to the same level of critical inquiry as anything else. And to have written that in the 1780s was radical, especially in a country he lived in like Prussia, where he was living under a king. That's one other thing I always try to do as well, is just to highlight the fact that being an atheist is in so many ways a product of affluence and a product of education, just as much as it is a product of sort of the mechanics of the brain.
Yeah, no, that's well said.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So let's move on. So you have been in the podcast space for a while. I first came to know you back when you had a show years ago called Atheistically Speaking. And if I remember right, because I remember when that show launched, that there were two people on the show. Am I correct about that?
Oh, yeah. When I launched in the very beginning, 4 or 5 years ago, or 3, I don't know, some number of years ago, I did. It was my idea, but I had a friend that was kind of going to do it with me, a really, really intelligent friend that I was looking forward to doing it with, but he just simply did not have the time to keep up. And one of the big problems with podcasting, as I'm sure you know, is you really do have to be regular, and you got to be persistent, and you got to do it. And it ended up that it just wasn't going to work out. So very quickly I had to kind of go on my own and do more interviews. And occasionally I would just opine on stuff. And it's evolved quite a bit to the point where it is now. But I actually, that wasn't my first show. My first show was Thomas in the Bible back in 2010. I started it. Oh,
that's right. Yes, I remember you mentioning that on the early days of Atheistically Speaking. Yes, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I don't do it anymore. I finished the Bible finally. But that was the first thing I did, and I got noticed by a couple people, like Cognitive Dissonance. Those guys were kind enough to have me on their show, and it really opened things up for me. And it's a crazy, weird thing to be doing, but
that's cool. That's cool.
What I'm doing. Yeah.
So let's move on to talk a little bit about I think the big thing that I was very interested in discussing with you, which was that I've sort of had a change of heart within the last probably year or so about atheism and skepticism in some ways. I would say that I was your typical sort of atheist skeptic. You know, I was a fan of, you know, and sort of a very uncritical fan of, say, like Sam Harris, and I loved the Rubin Report and all that kind of shit. And I just sort of had a real change of heart. I sort of realized for a few things. One, no one genuinely is above criticism, and just because somebody speaks very calmly and sounds very rationally doesn't mean they're right. That was something that really took me a minute to get. And the other thing was just the extent to which Dave Rubin is a complete charlatan, and that was the other thing. Did you ever?
You're preaching to the choir here? Yeah, I feel like I mean, I'm still a Sam Harris fan. I really disagree with him on a lot of stuff, but I feel like I was maybe the forefront of this dude. Dave Rubin is not saying anything. He just says battle of ideas over and over. You know,
yep.
Aggressive left was just over and over, and there'd just be nothing to it. And I was just like, am I the only one? Am I nuts? What is happening? And apparently, you know, you can make a good living doing that, I guess.
Absolutely. You can make an incredible living pretending to be all things to all people while simultaneously believing in nothing.
Yeah. Except for your one critical bogeyman, you know, SJWs. They have one villain. Anyone else is fair game to pander to, but that one group. You'll notice that is the fundamental rule in everything that Dave Rubin does.
Absolutely, which is part of and that was really, discovering that aspect of it really changed me, because I'm also a huge fan of Sam Seder and the Majority Report. I think he's awesome. And Michael Brooks, who's a contributor to his podcast, these guys are...
Oh, yeah, okay. I was going to say, I know that name, and then you said Michael Brooks I like quite a bit. I think he's also on that show, right?
Brooks is fantastic. He is, I think, one of the guys who is one of the best, I think, critics of the whole "the sky is falling because of Islam" thing. I think he's really good at articulating, I think, criticisms of that. His, like, quote unquote debate with Carl Benjamin was hilarious. That was ridiculous. But anyway, for me, it was basically the fact that first off, Dave Rubin doesn't take criticism very well. So there was that article that came out, I think, last year that was in Mother Jones, which basically sort of lumped him in with people on the alt-right. And he got all apoplectic and pissed off and shit. And I found it very interesting that, like, he's always talking about how, you know, it's a free marketplace of ideas and you have to be tough. And yet when someone actually genuinely criticizes the fact that he sort of cozies up to people like Weird Mike Cernovich or Alex Jones, that's really a problem and should be criticized for that. And he got all angry. And I thought it was really funny that, you know, the only Brooks and Seder were like, we'll come on your show. You're always talking about how, you know, the left is this, the left is that. We're on the left. We'll come on your show. We'll do it. And crickets. And I think part of it is that Dave Rubin maybe fundamentally knows deep down inside that he's too dumb to sit down next to them. I think it totally would break the spell. Yeah, I think it. Yeah. I mean, it just is in no way in his interest to do that. He would never. I mean, the one thing he also does is he will trumpet like some of the, you know, I had this person on or this person on from the left. But then if you actually go watch those interviews, they're from 5 years ago, you know, or whenever he started the show, 2 years ago or what it was. And B, they didn't talk about any of the subjects that most liberals want to criticize him on, which is, you know, all the typical free speech, the kids are ruining everything with college, all that stuff. He had liberals on who tend to agree with him on those topics. So he never really had any sort of meaningful pushback. You're right. Like, for example, I remember a couple years ago, he had David Sirota on, who is a journalist on the left, who I actually quite like. He's written a really good book on the 1980s that's kind of neat. But yeah, like, he had Sirota on to sort of criticize the left from that side. And I just find it very interesting that, like, he's hypercritical about, some people call them SJWs. The term I tend to use is the left trademark, like where it's like you package it up and you sell it in a store. But it is that, he's very willing to sort of be heavily critical of that, but then he'll sit with somebody like David Horowitz, and David Horowitz will basically call Barack Obama a communist and an ISIS sympathizer, and he says nothing. And I found that to be just completely intellectually bankrupt. And for me, the big breaking point was when he had Katie Hopkins on. That was like, okay. And I should have known earlier, because there was a breaking point way before, but I just was too naive. But but to have Katie Hopkins on, the lady who said we need to have a final solution for Muslims after the Manchester attack, that was the moment I was like, no, you were.
Well, I'm glad you eventually figured it out, because it really is so frustrating. Especially, it would be one thing if Dave Rubin was going on in the backdrop of liberals controlling every branch of government and like a new, just one new deal after the next and stuff like that. But in the backdrop of Republicans actually unfairly and unjustly controlling every branch of government through unfair means like gerrymandering and that kind of thing, voter suppression. In that backdrop, still doing this gimmick of the highest value is triggering the libs, like triggering libtards is the highest value. Anything else is okay as long as it's triggering liberals. And so when, and I remember when he had that Katie Hopkins interview, it might've been that one, it could have been any of them really, where it's, what he does is he sets it up. And a lot of people in this bullshit center do this, where they try to set it up like, oh, people are going to be triggered by this, like trying to anticipate it. And it's like, yeah, they will be triggered by that because it's disgusting. And you can't just like make it into my fault for being offended by something if you predict it. If I go like, oh, dude, you're going to be triggered by this, and then I punch you in the face, it's like, okay, well, yeah, I am triggered by that because you punched me in the face. It doesn't make me the bad guy.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's kind of like there was the other point where Ali Rizvi, the ex-Muslim activist who I think is a really interesting guy, he basically like criticized Dave Rubin for going on Alex Jones around the anniversary of Sandy Hook. And it's very interesting. I tweeted out something along the lines of, when you side with Alex Jones over an ex-Muslim who's criticizing your platforming someone who said the awful things about Sandy Hook, we kind of know where your loyalties are. We kind of know what you're doing.
He, as I said, I really think what explains it best, if you look at all of his behavior, is, again, the one group you cannot pander to is SJWs or the progressives or whatever. Anything else is fair game. And that's exactly evidenced by going on Alex Jones. When you can go on Alex Jones and not just argue, just yell at him for being such a creep and a horrible, just disgusting perpetuator of fake news and awful conspiracies about Sandy Hook victim, just disgusting stuff. If you're able to just sit there and go, no, it's cool, we can just talk and be reasonable. The only explanation is that you need something from him, and what you need from him is the millions of listeners he has, and he will go. Dave Rubin will go to anybody who has millions of listeners, as long as they have a common enemy in progressives. It doesn't matter what else there is about the person, as long as you have a common enemy in progressives, he will go on your show or have you on his show. And then you notice he does the thing where he'll say like, okay, it's time that I talk to a liberal, and then it'll be like, okay, Barack Obama, want to come on the show? It's like, yeah, okay. You will talk to a liberal if it's one of the most famous people. He'll always try to get celebrities on or anybody with millions of followers. And that's the only time you'll see him extend an invitation to a liberal. And no one has taken him up on it yet, because I just don't think they have time for it. But that's where he'll use that as an excuse. Well, I asked, I asked Sotomayor, he'll have some just random, celebrity example. Oh, I asked them to come on. They didn't come on.
And I find that just to be I find it to be very cagey and dishonest. And it speaks to who he is. I would say the other thing that I think, the one thing to help you understand exactly what's going on too, is there's like a clip of him from maybe 5 or 6 years ago doing stand-up, and it's painful. He's a terrible, awful, unfunny comedian whose whole bit is built around him being gay, which is ironic for a guy who constantly bitches about identity politics.
Right. I've never seen that, and I don't really think I want to. I think that he tapped into something that is going on within not only politics, which is an anti-progressivism in general, but is also going on in the atheist movement. And a reason that I haven't been caring too much about the atheist movement anymore, which is that I really do think anti-progressivism has trumped everything. When you see how many people are worshiping at the altar of Jordan B. Peterson and Ben Shapiro, it's just when you've gotten to the point where you have more in common with a theocrat, who thinks that we all get our morals secretly from Christianity, but they're also against those uppity groups that are using identity politics. That's when you've lost it to me. Like you don't really care about free thought or secularism or anything like that. You care about being anti-progressive first and foremost. And so honestly, like if that's what people want to do, that's fine. But there's so much of atheism that is that now that it really has made me want to just focus in on the issues I care about, which in this day and age, you can't get away from the fact that we're in just a historically absurd and horrific period in American politics. And that's more important than virtually anything else to me.
No, I totally agree. And I've sort of, like you, in many ways, I think I've evolved along with it. I think within that same vein, there's a point that you've made that was really like, I found it super interesting, and I'd love to hear you kind of unpack it a little bit. You described the whole brouhaha about campus craziness as being akin to the war on Christmas. And I thought that was such an interesting point, and I'd love to sort of hear from you, what do you mean by that? Because I think that's an interesting distinction.
Well, first and foremost, the obvious similarity is that they're both Fox News segments. I mean, they are both literally. I mean, this is not an exaggeration. Those are both literally segments that will be on. One is more holiday oriented stuff. The war on Christmas, of course, it only comes around for a few months out of the year. But Campus Craziness is a standby for what's his name, the awful person who inherited Tucker Carlson.
Oh yeah,
Riley's spot. It's literally a segment on Fox News. It's a misinformation tool. It's a tool to rile people up about nothing. And just like all of these things, there's little kernels of truth to it. There's little examples. Yeah, there are plenty of college kids who yell and are unreasonable. That's true. And we can find a bunch of examples of college kids being unreasonable, and we can all agree on those. Just like I'm sure maybe there's some asshole who yells at people who say Merry Christmas. I've never heard of them, but maybe you can find that somewhere. But it doesn't. But blowing it out of proportion and just focusing on it as a way of, I think it's a way of rallying. I think the biggest commonality between those two things, even though they're not exactly the same or anything, but a big point of commonality is just they're things that are used by groups that are actually in power to make them feel like they're the victims. And I think that's a lot of what Fox News has to do in this day and age, because they control everything. Their party literally controls everything. Their demographic, which is older white men, by the way, it's actually older white people. It's not just a man thing. Like Fox News viewers are average age, in the 60s somewhere higher, and they're very white. And they are the ones who historically and still today have had all the power in our society for the most part. And they need these things, these gimmicks, to feel like they're losing control, because that's what motivates people. That's what having a fear like that is what motivates people to watch and to donate, to give money, to do whatever it is, buy the product placements that are on Fox News, buy gold and a safe and a bunch of food that'll last forever because Obama's going to destroy the world, all that crap.
I think you're right. And I think another component to it too is it's a way of deflecting from stuff that actually matters. So for example, we're seeing, whether it's the degradation of the environment, the complete corruption of Donald Trump's presidency. Like, as somebody who studies the American history, particularly the Gilded Age, I can tell you that Donald Trump's presidency is about as corrupt as maybe Grant's second term or Warren Harding. Like, we're getting into like whiskey ring, teapot dome territory in terms of corruption, and in terms of just sheer nepotism and greed and graft. And I find that, the hill that some of these people decide they want to fucking die on is being mad about, 18 to 22-year-old kids who are impassioned and want to change the world are getting shitty about something. I mean, I understand some of the legitimate issues regarding some things around campuses, but at the same time, some of that's caused by the right itself. And I think I may have even heard this on your show discussing the problem with Ann Coulter, where the whole brouhaha about her going to Berkeley. Well, the reason why, she got to claim a victim was because they told her, like, we'll give you this date and we will give you this amount of money and this amount of security if you are okay with doing this date. And she told them no. And she said, no, I'm going to do the date I want to do. And because of that, it became a shitstorm. And then she claimed a victim. It's like, no, you weren't a victim. They gave you everything that you could possibly have needed. And you decided to be an asshole about it to use it for your own gain. And I found that to be just so craven and just so shameless and cynical. And I just find that, I think you tweeted this out recently too, where it's like, we're going to equate the widespread rise of right authoritarianism and corruption with problems on college campuses. They're not even remotely in the same territory.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that one thing that doesn't get talked about a lot is people do freak out about, like, colleges are so radical. They're, this is what they're doing on the left, et cetera, et cetera. But we never talk about the equivalent on the right. And I don't even mean colleges. Like, that's one layer of it. There's right-wing religious universities that are way more right-wing and anti-intellectual than the leftiest of left-wing universities, of course. But I don't even mean that. I mean, what is the equivalent? Like, if the right is going too far, if the left is going too far in indoctrinating people in universities or whatever, I mean, we'd have to compare that to what goes on the right or what goes on without university. But if you were to compare an uneducated, somebody who never gets to attend a university to someone who has gone to a university, and compare, like, how informed they are and how good of citizens they are and how well they vote, or like how well they know about the issues, I would be very curious to see that data. But we never evaluate that. We just say colleges are ruining everything without comparing it to, like, what the alternative is, which is just being ignorant. Like, it's one thing if you can't go to college, but Republicans, like, actively hate, a lot of Republicans actively hate higher education, and like they're fighting a battle against higher education. And it's like, we're not evaluating that on equal terms. We're not saying, well, what's the alternative? Is the alternative that if you just, learn everything from Fox News and don't go to school, like, is that, because that seems horrible too. So it's not, even at a best case scenario, you could say, like, we're tied. Like, okay, sure, liberals indoctrinate people in schools, but Republicans, like, what's the alternative? They just, it's never compared in any equal footing.
You're right. And I'll just say briefly that as somebody who was in college, I'm a former libertarian, I'm a former objectivist, and I was involved in libertarian student groups in college for a couple of years and everything like that. And I can tell you that the reason I left it was to the extent to which I found out how much everything I was involved in everything was connected to donors, and how the donor class basically created this entire cultural and intellectual network for young people to be in so that they're not exposed to stuff on the left. And almost all of it was exclusively done by the Koch brothers. And when I learned that, I was kind of like, oh, this isn't really about the pursuit of ideas. Or if it is, that's not really the end game. The end game is something even, I think, more cynical. But anyway, I guess, you've been so generous with your time. I know we're getting close. I guess I just want to ask you one final question. with my show, I'm very interested in conceptualizing a better form of secular humanism. And that's kind of the project I'm interested in, is how can we articulate secular humanism for people and a way of life that is full of meaning and joy and purpose and equality and freedom without the need for religion. So I guess my last question for you would be, for you, what is the connection between social justice and secular humanism, and why do those matter to you?
Well, I do think humanism is the key. I think that's something that I'm not even at all an expert to talk about. I'm not, I've interviewed humanists. I've looked into it a little bit, but I'm not involved in any serious way in humanism. And I think the people who are doing a great thing, and we should look to them and look to humanist organizations to lead the way there. And I think that when it comes to social justice, for me, what matters more than anything are two things for me, like getting our facts from good sources, believing in expertise and institutions, not unflinchingly, not obviously not you question everything, but this disintegration of expertise that's happened is key. And I know it might not seem exactly related to what you just asked, but I actually do think it is. I think it's pretty critical because the sides that are anti-social justice have a vested interest in there being no such thing as expertise, and there being kind of this underground knowledge, and like the institutionalized knowledge is bullshit, and they're trying to make you believe a bunch of stuff. It needs to rely on that because, which gets me to the biggest point, I think what I've learned from doing my best to educate myself in the last few years of reading more widely than I ever had, and reading civil rights authors and just all this stuff, is that white people in this country have every incentive to not do that. We have every incentive to just not bother learning our history and not bother really understanding the extent to which people of color in this country have been, I don't know what the best phrase is, held back, have been not given the same benefits of social programs through all these years, housing discrimination. Like there's a whole history. We think of it as just like, white people in this country think like, okay, well, slavery was bad, but we got rid of that. And then, there's some voting rights stuff. And then we fixed that. And then it's fine. That's the easy thing for white people to think in this country. It's easy to say, we fixed it. It's great. We're good. We're fine. It's been 50 years, since the last major incident. We're good. And it's just not the truth. And once you recognize all the biases and all the ways in which that's what you would want to think if you were, a white person in this country, it's so much easier to think that than to think, oh shit, we never really in any serious way made up for this, we really never did. And it's so much easier to think like, well, we're all individuals. That's why you see it like the anti-social justice people. It's always about individualism, and it's no accident. It's because when you could just talk about individuals, you don't have to ever be accountable for the very imbalanced history. And so I know that's a long-winded, weird answer to your question, but I think that is the key. It doesn't matter, we can argue, or we can be in different places when it comes to how social justice-y we all want to be. It's not like you have to be a flaming, far lefty, whatever, but just at least recognizing that there's a lot we haven't accounted for, and not immediately spitting in the face of anyone who wants to try to make things better and wants to try to, outline where we've fallen short, like listening to that, because there's such a violent reaction to shut that down, and to really just never get close to properly examining the very real ways we've fallen short. So I think that's critical. And then from there, it's details. If we can all agree that we want to make things better and that we haven't done a great job of that in our society in the past, and there's things we haven't atoned for, then we can debate the details. But like it's that fundamental rejection that I think if you're rejecting that, then I don't know how we can properly have any real communication in a serious way about humanism or social justice. So.
I agree, and I think that you've articulated something I say a lot in the podcast, which is that there is this corrosion of institutions, and political, social, economic, cultural, and I think a lot of people on the sort of anti-SJW side, their whole intent is to sort of. I like the way you said it, to sort of keep it that way so that they could sort of fill in that void. And I would rather say, no, I think, this is what I think they also don't understand too, is that when you have a society that's built upon social justice and social democracy, you actually get a greater birth of freedom. This is something that Karl Polanyi wrote about in his book, The Great Transformation. He was an economist. And he made this exact argument, which is that when you actually guarantee a certain level of equality in a society, both economically and politically, you actually give people have more freedom to be who they want to be. They can actually be more of an individual than they would under a system where they don't have a certain level of political and economic equality. So that's always been my argument. But I do see there's a huge streak of it that's anti-democratic and a streak of it that's anti-intellectual and anti-institutional. And I think that the goal of, in my estimation at least, the goal of social justice is to bolster those things to broaden freedom and equality. So I pretty much agree with you. Again, Thomas, thank you so much you've been super generous with your time. I know you're like super busy with a billion projects. Let people know where they can find you.
Sure. I mean, SeriousPod.com has my main podcast, everything, or just search for Serious Inquiries Only on any sort of podcasty thing. I'm also on Opening Arguments. That's a very valuable show in this day and age, talking about the legal ramifications of everything, Trump news, all that stuff. So that's a great resource too. But yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to come on the show.
Oh, no problem. I enjoyed the conversation as well. As always, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Tumblr at The Daily Clerk. You check out our website, reasonrevolution.org. All available episodes and additional content are there. I'll be dropping a blog this week about Martin Gardner and free will, so we look forward to checking that out, hopefully getting some feedback on that. You can check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/reasonrevolution. And then Twitter, at ReasonRevPod. We have a lot of the articles and all the memes and all the good stuff there. And until next week, this has been Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.